Batman comics?
Tell them who your favorites are. What are your favorite comics? Oh, well, tell them.
I watched the show.
You watch the show, the Batman, the animated series, maybe?
The cartoon. And tell them the other one we watch in the car all the time.
The cartoon and which one?
The other one we watch in the car all the time. What's the theme song of that one? We watch the Adam West.
66,
Yeah.
yeah, we're gonna talk
That's our
about
two
that
favorites.
briefly, yeah. Yeah, those
That's our
are
two
good.
favorites.
Are you a comic book fan?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You DC or Marvel guy?
I do them all. X-Men and Batman are like my top two.
Good. You know much about Batman's history?
So I just read a book. It was all about the 66 series. So it's Back to the Batcave.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's Adam West books.
Yeah, haven't read that.
That was my jam when I was a little kid. They would show 2 episodes of that every night.
Yeah.
Part 1, part 2, and then I would have to go to sleep after that.
Yeah, it was a cliffhanger for the next one. Yeah, it was good. Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Hey, those go away with the stars. You got it.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the lights since I
Yeah.
can't play the video and come turn off the lights.
Very good, thank you.
I'm gonna go ahead. Yes, already. There we go. It's still pretty light. Okay, well, welcome. My name's Laura Wilkins. Glad you're here tonight at the Cultural Arts Center. And tonight it's our pleasure to welcome Daniel Boone, who's going to be speaking with us about the secret history of Batman. You may have been here for his talk, I believe it was in June, right? For the origins of Superman, and if you were, welcome back. And everyone else, welcome to the Cultural Arts Center, and we're so looking forward to your talk tonight, Daniel. So I will let you begin, and then when you're ready, I will play your video.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. My name's Daniel Boone. I'm from Jeffersonville. I'm retired. I'm a comic book fan. Last year was Superman's 85th anniversary, and I thought it would be fun to put together a PowerPoint history of how he came to be. This year is Batman's 85th anniversary, so I thought I'd do the same for Batman. We got a small crowd. If anybody has any questions or comments or reactions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can make eye contact with me, or if there's a pause in the presentation and you want to put a comment out there, feel free to do so. We're going to start the presentation by showing a 3-minute animated film that came out 10 years ago to honor Batman's 75th anniversary. And then after we're done seeing this, we'll talk about it a little bit and then get into the lecture. Thanks, Laura.
I need every drop of her precious blood for my experiment. Now take her inside. I'm nearly ready for... Wait. What's that sound? don't scare me! Stay back!
Is it over?
For now.
It's a far cry from the '66 Batman with all the bright colors and the campiness. This film, I think, was inspired by two things. This is the cover of Detective Comics number 39, Batman's 4th appearance ever. And you can, thanks Laura for doing that. You can see he's got the long ears, you know, the white slits. There's the kind of atmospheric mist and clouds. The villain in that short film was actually Dr. Hugo Strange, and he was inspired by Dr. Death, and he appeared in Detective Comics number, I think it was 29. And you may notice too that the costume that Batman wore in that short animated film we just saw, he didn't have the yellow oval there. That was a recent addition, and I like your shirt, in 1966, so that they could copyright that emblem and make more money. The people at DC Comics didn't think they could copyright just a black bat, so that's where that yellow oval came. And you might also notice too that he doesn't have the scalloped gauntlets, like the little fins on his gloves there too, and that's how Batman was originally envisioned when he first appeared in Detective Comics number 27. Does anybody have any thoughts or reactions about that film we just saw? Kind of scary. The large hulking figure was an old DC character named Solomon Grundy that they actually based, kind of inspired the Hulk for Marvel Comics later on. Okay, so we have Batman's very first appearance in Detective Comics number 27. That appeared in 1939, but a month prior to that, in the April edition of Detective Comics, we see this image for the very first time. This is the very first time we see Batman in comic book form. This image has a lot of significance that we'll get to towards the very end of the presentation, so we'll return to that later. Batman was really popular. He was probably the second most popular DC character at the time, second only to Superman. And in 1943, they had a movie serial. These were like episodic 15-minute shorts that were shown prior to the main feature. They always had a cliffhanger, so you'd want to come back the next week and see what else happens. That's kind of where they got that idea in Batman from '66. And then here's Batman '66. They made use of colored television, which was brand new back then. And they had a real campy feel, went kind of far away from that original conceptualization that we saw. While doing research for this, I found something interesting, that the length of Batman's ears is generally correlated with how evil, sinister, like gothic he is. The shorter the ears, like the less like fearful he is, like maybe even the more campy he is. And then we have the 1989 film with starring Michael Keaton, directed by Tim Burton, and this movie was a box office sensation, broke all sorts of records for box office. Batman the Animated Series came out from, I think it was 92 to about 95, and many consider this to be the best depiction of Batman on screen. These are really worth looking at too. They were inspired by the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons that we referenced the last time. And in 2005, we begin the Batman trilogy by Christopher Nolan, starring Christian Bale. The first film, Batman Begins, was a critical success, but didn't make as much money as they were hoping for. The sequel, The Dark Knight, which featured Heath Ledger's Joker performance, where he won an Oscar, set so many box office records they couldn't count all the money they were making. The second movie, The Dark Knight, was the second highest grossing movie in history for several years, second only to Titanic. Then in 2017, we see Zack Snyder's Batman, portrayed by Ben Affleck. First one was in Dawn of Justice. Justice League came out, Dawn of Justice was 2016. Justice League came out in 2017. If you haven't seen it yet, I strongly encourage you not to see that. Instead, see this Zack Snyder version, which is a vastly superior film. In fact, they're like night and day. You can't even tell they're the same film. More recently, in 2022, we see The Batman, starring Robert Pattinson, and it gets even darker in tone. In this film, he's more of a detective, and he's hunting down a serial killer. The sequel to this is scheduled to come out in 2026. And in 2 weeks, Amazon Prime is releasing a brand new Batman animated series called The Caped Crusader. And Bruce Timm is the showrunner. He's the same person who's responsible for Batman the Animated Series. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that looks. All right, what we're going to do next is go through a bunch of characteristics that can be attributed to Batman. He has bat-like wings. He invokes a sense of dread and fear. He's described as has a terror in human form. He has a secret identity. He has a faithful servant. He had no qualms about killing the guilty. Now, a lot of people think Batman has an oath not to kill people. Well, that's a latter contribution to the mythos. Originally, he had no qualms at all about shooting people or even killing people. We're going to show some images where he's actually holding a gun. He uses illusion, misdirection, and theatricality. He leaves without a trace and appears and disappears in the shadows, and describes himself as an avenger of wrong. So this sounds a lot like Batman, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, guess what? This describes Spring Hill Jack, who is an urban legend set in London, based upon some true events that occurred. His stories were documented in what are called penny dreadfuls. These appeared in the late 1800s up until the early 1900s. And they were a precursor to the pulp magazines that some of you may be familiar with. I think it's interesting. This is one of the later depictions of Spring Hill Jack. Allegedly, he wore springs in his boots, which allowed him to jump high distances, like to clear fences. Okay. And he went after bad guys, and the legend was sometimes he'd kill them. But I think this cover here is interesting. In terms of the positioning, it's similar to this. You've got 3 villains here. You've got 3 villains here. You've got 2 of them looking up in amazement. The wings are spread. I don't know if Batman's creators were aware of this. One of Batman's creators, Bill Finger, who was the writer pretty much, when he was a child and an adolescent, he had scarlet fever, and he was bedridden for several months, if not years. I'm not sure if it was years or months. But anyway, during that time he was bedridden, he consumed a lot of literature, including Charles Dickens novels. And Charles Dickens was a Victorian writer, and Spring Hill Jack came out during the Victorian times too. So it is possible that Bill Finger may have been aware of Spring Hill Jack. That hasn't been documented anywhere that he was. That's interesting. Another of Batman's ancestors is Zorro. In the 1920 silent film, The Mark of Zorro, he wore a mask, he had a black outfit on, he had a cloak, he used acrobatics. He had a secret hideout that he got to through a grandfather clock. He even had a Batmobile in a sense, and that was his horse. He had a black horse that served as his way of getting around. And Batman's co-creators both acknowledged that The Mark of Zorro was very influential in how they depicted Batman. In fact, in later years, the Batman origin story where Bruce Wayne's parents are gunned down, guess what movie they were leaving? The Mark of Zorro. Yeah. So that was added, though, later. in 1926, there was a silent film called The Bat. And the villain there, you can see his silhouette there on the right-hand image. This is how he looked. Real scary looking. And he was a bad guy. So bats were frequently associated with being bad, being criminal. There was a remake of it that came out in 1930 called The Bat Whispers. And in this rendition, the bat, again, is a bad guy, but he's also a detective. And this is how he looked. So he wore a cowl, had a mask, he was dressed in black. He did his activity at night. He used deception. He used like smoke to enter and leave. He used acrobatics, and he instilled fear in the people that he was trying to intimidate. So Bob Kane, one of Batman's co-creators, attributes this film as being influential in how he envisioned Batman as well. So anyway, this came out in 1930. In 1931, there's Dracula, directed by Todd Browning. I don't know if you all have heard of him. He's from Louisville. He also directed Freaks and a few other like gothic horror movies. And so I wanted to, this was like one of the first, when Dracula comes on and they go through the credits, look at this. You got this bat wing figure here, and that is very similar to how Batman appears, with the ears and then the eyes without pupils. And just to, well, I wanted to point out some similarities here too. This is a promotional poster for Dracula, and then here's Detective Comics number 31. You know, when both the protagonist is in the background, takes a prominent position, there's like a full moon in the background, you've got this ethereal, smoky kind of atmosphere going on, and you also have like a villain carrying a damsel in distress there. So, I mean, that's kind of cool how similar those are. One may have been influenced by the other, I don't know. But just to bring the point home even more, this image of Batman on the right, I believe, was directly influenced by this, even down to the feet position. Yeah. You know, and he's holding the cloak up to kind of disguise his face. Another pulp figure back then was the Shadow. He first appeared in 1933 in the pulp magazines, but he was also a very popular radio show who was voiced by Orson Welles. Who knows? The Shadow knows. And again, he has a cloak, he wears a mask, he uses theatricality, deception, a lot of hand-to-hand combat. And in these images here on the right, we see Batman swinging from a rope, which the Shadow used to do to get around. And then in this image, Batman's making use of like suction cups to go up a wall, and look, Shadow's doing that too. Now later on, we're going to talk about how the Batman's creators lifted Batman's entire origin, well, not his origin story, but his first appearance directly from a Shadow pulp magazine. Okay, we got Dick Tracy. I think he appeared in 1933. I'm sorry, 1931. And he was a detective. He used a lot of gadgets. And he also adopted a 10-year-old like sidekick named Junior Tracy. Does anybody want to guess who that might have influenced? Robin. Yeah, I think Robin may have been influenced by that. In addition to these narrative elements, just stylistically, Batman's main artist, Bob Kane, drew in this cartoony style. Not a realistic style, but a more cartoonish style. Dick Tracy also had a rogues gallery where all of the villains, or most of the villains, had some sort of unfortunate genetic abnormality. Prune face, flat head. And that influenced Batman's creators to come up with their own rogues gallery. Again, most of them having some sort of genetic abnormality. Now, Bob Kane, who for decades, up until 1989, was considered Batman's sole creator. I'm going to make a case today in this presentation that he wasn't Batman's sole creator, and that he stole a lot of credit from other people that were working under him, especially Bill Finger. Bob Kane was not a very good artist, in my opinion. And he would frequently borrow, if not outright steal, ideas from other artists. So this is a Dick Tracy character called The Mask. Well, look at this guy. Got the same kind of hat, same kind of ascot, probably even has the same number of creases there if you count them. You know, he's wearing like the gloves there, same kind of jacket he wears. Another character around that time that influenced them was the Lone Ranger. He first appeared in 1933. He had a sidekick, Tonto. And in this promotional poster, he's wearing a mask there too. Then we have Doc Savage. He was another pulp hero. He first appeared in 1933. He was a self-made man. He had no superpowers, but he studied. You know, he went to foreign countries to learn from different cultures. He exercised. He was like the peak of physical perfection. He didn't have a utility belt, but he had a utility vest. Okay. And he used deductive reasonings and logic in his battles against criminals. These are two other pulp magazines that were out around that time too. On the left we have The Spider. That was in 1933. He was one of these no-nonsense crime fighters, you know, kind of worked outside the law. I'm always interested in the origins of these comic book superheroes. If you see Spider there, Master of Men, if you eliminate Master of, you get Spider-Men. And that webbing there reminds me of somebody, you know, that Marvel came up with a little bit later. On the right here is another pulp magazine, Black Bat Detective Mysteries. The main detective in that one was known as the Black Bat. And in this pulp magazine, we have a character named the Bat. And he wears a hood that's got like a white symbol of a bat on the forehead. And let's see, what year was that? That was 1934. All of these people and characters are preceding Batman that came out in 1939. Oh, one thing I wanted to point out on this, when the Bat was trying to decide what's my crime-fighting identity going to be, a bat flies through the window and he goes, aha, I'll become a bat. Well, Bob Kane and Bill Finger, they weren't afraid to steal ideas from pulp characters. Look what happens here in Batman's origin story. This is from Detective Comics number 33. A bat flies in, and Bruce Wayne says almost word for word what that pulp character said in the prior panel. A bat, that's it, it's an omen, I shall become a bat. So I think they're lifting that from that other pulp character. The Scarlet Pimpernel was a French Revolution hero. He wore a mask at night. During the day, he was a playboy. He was very wealthy. He was kind of foppish, you know. It's like he was real supercilious. But at night, he would don this mask and go and try to save people that were about to be guillotined during the French Revolution. And this was a film that came out, I think it was like 1936 or so, starring Leslie Howard. The Phantom was another comic book character. He was the first character that wore a skin-tight suit. And he has a mask, and they don't show his pupils. They just show like these little slits. And he was mortal. He didn't have a bat cave, he had a skull cave. That was his hideout. And his parents were killed by pirates, so he was an orphan. So, like, all of these kind of ideas were gestating and may have influenced the Batman's co-creators. Here's another pulp magazine that came out in 1936, Spicy Mystery Stories. Batman, that's the first time that the term Batman is seen in terms of the standard history. We're going to get to a secret history later on where Batman was actually someone came up with that term in 1932 that we'll get to.
What year was that again, Daniel? What year is that again?
1936.
Thank you.
Yes. And then we have another character named the Black Bat. Now, if we put, he came out in 1939, the same year, almost the same month as Batman in Detective Comics. But if we put some tall ears, this guy would look exactly like Batman. It was uncanny. And here you see that he's got these like scalloped gauntlet gloves there. Bill Finger, one of Batman's co-creators, said that we stole that idea from the Black Bat. Batman originally just said, well, we'll get to it in a little bit. Batman originally didn't have any gloves at all. And then he had gloves, and then later on they put like those scalloped gauntlets on it. Here's another picture depicting the Black Bat. Again, if you put some ears there, he'd look just like Batman. Anybody have any questions so far? Comments? All right. This is Bob Kane, who for decades was thought to be Batman's creator. We're going to find out later that he didn't do it by himself, but he stole credit from other people who contributed to it. While Superman's creators, we talked about this last month, while Superman's creators were inspired by their personal psychologies, emotional issues, developmental histories, personal trauma, and financial needs, Bob Kane's main motivation in creating Batman was purely about the Benjamins. This is Bob Kane's early drawings. You know, they were real cartoony. He drew like filler comic strips in some early DC comics. He first collaborated with Bill Finger in 1938. He came up with this comic strip called Rusty and His Pals, which was a kind of a takeoff of Terry and the Pirates by Milton Caniff. And then he and Bill Finger came up with an adventure strip called Clip Carson, Soldier of Fortune. And you can see in these illustrations that it's, well, I don't mean to sound harsh, but it's very primitive. And it's wooden, and it's sterile, and there's nothing really inspiring about it. Again, I submit that Bob Kane wasn't a very good artist. Now compare that with some illustrations by Alex Raymond and Hal Foster, who were doing Sunday strips. This was Flash Gordon, and you can just see how beautiful that is and how well it's composed, and it's majestic and imaginative and colorful and dynamic. This is another Alex Raymond image from a Sunday comic strip. The Sunday strips allowed the artist to think outside the three panels that we normally think, and allowed him to do things really creative. Bill Watterson does that with Calvin and Hobbes, you know, just breaks all sorts of barriers and does all sorts of creative things. But I want to draw your attention to this panel over here. Alex Raymond depicted this race of hawkmen that had wings, you know, made so that they could fly. And this is a Tarzan image drawn by Hal Foster. You can just see how beautiful it is, how anatomically correct it is, how dynamic it is, and then again contrast that to what Bob Kane was doing. So I can kind of understand why Bob Kane would swipe other people's work. You know, I don't think he was that good of an artist. So Superman burst onto the scene in 1938. Very soon after he first appeared, they were selling 1 million copies a month. And there were a lot of imitators. Imitators for other companies were sued for copyright infringement because their characters were similar to Superman in some ways. So the challenge was, how do we create a new superhero and not get sued or not have any copyright issues? How do we create a unique hero? Now, to Finger and Kane's credit, they came up with a hero. I wouldn't call him a superhero because usually superheroes are beings that have superpowers beyond what normal humans do. Batman's a normal human being. As they said in Justice League, his superpower is that he's rich. You know, but anyway, Superman is godlike almost with his powers, whereas Batman is mortal. Superman pretty much is indestructible, whereas Batman could be easily injured, and he was in his early adventures. Superman would deal with conflict through brawn and power and strength, whereas Batman would use reasoning and logic. Superman was from another planet, where Batman was from Earth. Superman's creators made use of primary colors, the red, yellow, and blue. It was kind of bright and cheerful, whereas Batman, as he was originally conceived, they used a lot of blacks and grays. Superman's adventures usually took place during the day, whereas Batman's usually took place at night. And Superman, the hero, did not wear a mask. Batman wears a mask. Superman's alter ego, Clark Kent, he's the one who's in disguise, where Bruce Wayne is not. So that's another way that they're different. Again, this cover from Detective Comics number 27, I think it's like a wink and a nod to this Action Comics cover in terms of where Batman's position, his body orientation. In both, he's dangling a bad guy, and they're both wearing green suits. I don't think that's a coincidence. And they also have like that pale yellow background there. All right, we're not going to have time to go through this video, but if you have time, you might want to check it out. It's called Unspeakable. Bob Kane stole all the credit for Batman. This is something that comic book historians have been investigating and going into a lot of depth with, but this video nicely puts it all together. Comic Tropes is the channel. Bill Finger was very shy and quiet, whereas Bob Kane was really loud and boisterous and brought a lot of attention to himself. Bob Kane also had the benefit of having a father who was a lawyer. Most of these comic book creators and writers were like teenagers or in their early 20s of very meager financial means. And even back then, corporations, in this case National Allied Publications, which was to later become DC Comics, they took advantage of the people that were working for them. They exploited them. So Superman's creators, Siegel and Schuster, they sold the rights to Superman for a meager $130. And meanwhile, National Allied reaped all sorts of benefits from their creation. It was really unfair. An artist named Neil Adams advocated for them and finally got them some recompense much, much, much later in their lives, right before they were about to die. Well, Bob Kane's father, being a lawyer, encouraged Bob, when you go to National Allied Publications and sign your contract, make sure you have the contract written so that you are labeled the sole creator. And even though that wasn't the case, Bob Kane kind of extorted them because he later, at the time he signed the contract, he said he was underage. Which he wasn't. He said he was 18, he was actually 24, but he got DC Publications in a corner where he didn't want to have, or they didn't want to have to go through a lawsuit. They just assumed he was telling them the truth about his age. So that's kind of how he finagled this wonderful deal where he reaped all the benefits from the merchandising, from the movies, from the comic books, whereas Bill Finger died in obscurity, he died penniless, he died alone in an apartment. And no one knew about him until about 15 years after he died. The way Bob Kane originally conceived of Batman, he wanted to call him Birdman. And he wanted given that Superman was so popular, he thought, I'll just have a red spandex outfit. We've got the yellow belt here like Superman. We're going to have a domino mask. That way we'll distinguish him from Superman. Another way to distinguish him is that he's got blonde hair. He didn't describe him as having any powers in particular. And so he went to Bill Finger and said, hey, Bill, this is my idea for a new comic book character. Do you have any thoughts about it? And Bill Finger encouraged him to change the costume to make it darker, to get rid of the wings and instead have a scallop cape, to have gloves. If he's going to be a detective, he needs to have gloves or else he's leaving his fingerprints everywhere. He suggested him to have a cowl over his head rather than just a domino mask. And then he suggested the ears, the dark tone. He suggested Commissioner Gordon. He suggested the name Bruce Wayne. He suggested the Batmobile. He suggested Robin. He suggested Joker, Riddler, Catwoman, Penguin. everything that we associate with Batman came from Bill Finger. Now, Bob Kane says that he was influenced by Leonardo da Vinci's ornithopter. I don't know if you've ever seen that. This is what it looks like here. It's kind of like a glider that Leonardo came up with. And Bob Kane says that from that Leonardo da Vinci drawing, that's where I got the idea of like a Batman with bat wings. I don't think that's true. I'm going to go through the reasons why. I think he made that up. Again, let's return to that Alex Raymond panel of the Hawk Men with their wings. When Batman came out in 1989, the Tim Burton, Michael Keaton movie, that represented all sorts of like marketing and merchandising opportunities for everyone associated with Batman, including Bob Kane. So he published a series of prints that you could buy at the Warner Brothers studios, and he slapped on them that they were drawn in 1939. A lot of comic historians think that he did those in 1989 and then put that date 1939 on to make it look like he was the one who came up with the idea of Batman. So this, according to Bob Kane, this was his version of Batman, but we already know that this was his version of Batman. We know this because he talks about it in his biography. And there was another comic book history book that came out in 1970 by Jim Steranko where he interviewed Bill Finger, and Bill Finger had the exact same story. So we know that this wasn't his image of Batman. And this is another drawing he did over here where he puts the date 1934. Well, he didn't even come up with the idea of Batman until 1939. I mean, before then, he was just drawing those like anthropomorphic comic strips involving like animal cartoony figures. So that's not true either. Now this image, this is a Frank Miller image from Batman Year One, which kind of they got from these images. This is an image that showed up in Detective Comics number 27. This was the image that Bob Kane says he came up with in 1939. But this was the finished image that showed up in the comic book. Usually when you put a finished image in a comic book, it's going to be more refined and clearer and sleeker and more polished than the one that you base it on. But Kane's doing it in a backwards order. He's saying this one came first, and then this is the one that showed up in print. So again, that makes me think that this image, which again he says here it came out in 1939, I think he did it in 1989 and just made that date up. That's what I think. Similar thing here. This is another image that he slapped a date on, 1939. Oops, I'm sorry. That he slapped this date on, 1939. Well, here's the original image. And this was actually from 1939. And again, this image is much more polished and refined and professional and sleeker, more elegant. So I don't think that's true either. In 1965, there was a fanzine. I don't know if y'all are familiar with the zines from... Okay, some people are nodding their heads. People would write these things up on their typewriter, and then you print them off on a mimeograph machine. We talked about it last time with Siegel and Schuster. It's the one where it's like the blue ink, and you might get a little buzz from smelling the chemicals, and then they would staple it together and then mail it out. It was like a self-made promotion. So Jerry Bales in 1965 interviewed Bill Finger, and Bill Finger gave the lowdown on what really happened, how he contributed to Batman's creation. Bob Kane, who had a lot of money at stake, he came out with a very, very stern letter that showed up in this fanzine, Batmania. Oh, by the way, this article, Finger in Every Plot, showed up in the fanzine. It was called Kappa Alpha, is what it was called. Batmania is where Bob Kane's letter shows up. Oh, this is the actual article on that mimeographed blue ink paper where Bill Finger talks about how he helped develop Batman. Here's what Bob Kane says. He says, Bill Finger has given out the impression that he and not myself created the Batman as well as Robin and all the other leading villains and characters. This statement is fraudulent and entirely untrue. In psychology, we call that projection.
Yeah.
That means he's talking about himself. That is myth. The truth is that Bill Finger is taking credit for much more than he deserves, and I refute much of his statements here in print. The only proof I need to back my statement is that if Bill co-authored and conceived the idea either with me or before me, then he would most certainly have a byline on the strip along with my name. A byline is like where it says Batman by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. Bob Kane saying, well, since it didn't say and by Bill Finger, that means he didn't have anything to do with it, which that just doesn't make any logical sense to me at all. It's been 25 years now, and truthfully, time sometimes blurs the memory, and it's difficult to separate at times the myth from the truth. So I cannot blame Bill too much if at times his memory clouds. Again, I think he's talking about himself here. This is the cover to Jim Steranko's History of Comics, Volume 1. Came out in 1970, where they have the in-depth interview with Bill Finger where he shares how he contributed to the Batman myth. And in Batman and Me in 1989, Bob Kane finally comes clean and says, I must admit that Bill never received the fame and recognition he deserved.
What year was that again?
1989, 15 years after Bill Finger was dead. So he never got any financial compensation, never any recognition, never any fame. And the reason that Bob Kane finally came out in 1989 is because this is the year the Batman movie comes out. And there was a lot more scrutiny on Bob Kane and Batman's origin, and like all of these fanzine articles were coming out, so he finally admits that. Now, this guy, Mark Tyler Nobleman, he came out with a book called Bill the Boy Wonder, where he describes everything I just described, although he did it in a much clearer, more cohesive manner. The book is written like a comic book with images. It's a real easy read, but it goes through the entire story of what I just tried to share with you. I don't know what Mark Tyler Nobleman's motivation was, but he wanted to bring this story to light to help Bill Finger's family, like his survivors, out. It was a real noble kind of, well, he was a noble man, you know. And then Ty Templeton drew this comic strip here about how Batman would have been without Bill Finger, and it's really funny. I'll just point out a couple of panels here. He says, I caught a crook. What's with the wings, Pally? I lifted them from a Da Vinci sketch. Beyond that, I don't know. Look, is there some sort of a commissioner I can talk to? Not in this comic. Are there any other imaginative and colorful villains that need capturing? Nope. Well, I guess I'll go home. I wish I had a car. So all of those things that aren't there were not there because he didn't credit Bill Finger. Now finally in 2015, DC Comics and Warner Brothers finally decides to formally give Bill Finger credit. It was a long battle, but the Mark Tyler Nobleman book was about to come out. He had a Hulu documentary coming out called Bill and Me, which was going to really look bad on Warner Brothers and DC Comics. So that's why they finally relented and gave him credit. And then in Dawn of Justice in 2017, if you look closely, they give credit to Bill Finger right here. I don't know why they didn't use the word and. I don't know like what with signifies versus and, but here we have Siegel and Schuster, the creators of Superman. So anyway, Bill Finger's finally getting some credit. The name Bruce Wayne. Does anybody have any questions or comments so far? We're going to go into some of the swipes and steals here. Robert Bruce was a medieval guerrilla freedom fighter. He turned into the King of Scotland. Anthony Wayne was a Revolutionary War leader, known for his impulsive and sometimes mad battlefield exploits. That's where the name Bruce Wayne comes from. Here we have the Shadow using guns. And remember before I said Batman in his early adventures would use a gun. Bob Kane said we didn't think anything was wrong with Batman carrying a gun because the Shadow used one. And here we see the Black Bat with a gun, and there's Batman there with a gun holster. Again, I don't think Bob Kane was a good illustrator. What I'm about to show you now are a series of what are called swipes. That's when a comic book artist will either trace or copy another artist's work without giving them credit. This was from Flash Gordon, and you can see the same kind of body orientation there. The legs are in the same position. Batman's holding onto this rope, same way that Flash Gordon's holding onto the vine. And look at this. I mean, he even traces the end of that vine or rope. And then in Batman's first adventure, these are a bunch of swipes from, they were called Big Little books. They were books about this big and they were about this thick, made out of that pulpy paper, and they were illustrated. A lot of these illustrations that Bob Kane swiped are by Henry Vallely is his name. But here we see Commissioner Gordon here. Look, he's holding the phone. Look at his pinky there. It's the same pinky position there. So there's no doubt that Kane stole that. These are identical. And then in this image, in Detective Comics number 33, you see Bruce Wayne's parents getting gunned down. Well, Bob Kane took two images from one of the Big Little books, I think it's called Gangbusters in Action, and combined them. Real lazy artwork there. And then he doesn't give these guys credit. Here's some other images that were swiped. This guy here, Bruce Wayne's crying. This guy. You see Bruce Wayne over here thinking. Here he is there. And then this is from a Tarzan image drawn by Hal Foster of a native. And Batman's got that exact same position. Even look at the hand there. Those are close-ups, the little swipes. There was a Shadow story called the Partners of Peril. And Bob Kane borrowed this contraption and put it in the Batman story, the case of the Chemical Syndicate. You see that some innocent people are being put under a glass dome here. Well, in the case of the Chemical Syndicate, they're doing the same thing. These are all, we won't have time to go through all of these, but these are all elements of the case of the Chemical Syndicate, Batman's first appearance, that were directly taken from that Shadow story. So there was a lot of stealing going on back there. Even the chimneys, I mean, most of us could probably make an attempt at drawing a chimney, but Bob Kane swiped that too. From the Shadow story, here's the chimney, Partners of Peril, and then here's the chimney that he swiped. Here's a close-up of it. In that Shadow story, the Shadow is referred to as a bat-like creature 6 times. Even the story of how Bruce Wayne's parents were shot and killed may have been swiped from Superman's creator, Jerry Siegel. His father was working in a tailor shop, and there was an armed robbery where gunfire went off. His father wasn't hit by the bullet, but his father died the next day. They think he had a heart attack. So he was killed indirectly by an armed robbery. And so anyway, that Bruce Wayne origin story may have been borrowed by that too. Oh, here's another image of that swipe where you can see the parallels much easier. Here's another swipe too from another Batman adventure. Got this bridge here. Got two figures in the car, same sort of window. And Bob Kane even swiped from himself. This is a story, a panel from one of the Rusty and his pals adventures, and then he swiped it from one of his Batman stories. Now, Siegel and Schuster had a character named Dr. Occult that appeared in Adventure Comics in 1938, and in one of the last panels of a Dr. Occult story, they talk about a Batman, and Bob Kane worked in the same building, the same offices as Siegel and Schuster, and may have gotten the idea of a Batman from Siegel and Schuster as well. I know I'm hitting y'all with a lot of information. We're going fast. There's so much really good stuff. We got 10 minutes left. I'll try to get through it all. Y'all heard of Todd McFarlane? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, back in 1987, for a magazine called Comic Scene, which was done by the same people who used to do Starlog and Future Life, he drew this, and Todd McFarlane drew this image of Batman for a 1987 Batman comic for DC Comics. In 1989, when the new Batman movie was coming out, Bob Kane was approached by Comic Scene to draw a Batman cover. This was his Batman cover in 1989 that he passed off as his own, Bob Kane. So he's even swiping more recently, although this was in 1989. Now, again, I don't think Bob Kane's a good artist. Does anybody notice anything unusual about the feet here?
The perspective's wrong.
That?
Yeah.
Anything else anybody notice?
Looks like he's wearing high heels.
It does look like he's wearing high heels. Yeah, very observant. One thing I noticed was that for most of us, our feet are below our shoulders. Okay? And if you draw a straight line down, from here and here, they don't line up. So again, that makes me think that this was a Bob Kane swipe. Well, there's no doubt that's a swipe.
Did Todd McFarlane ever complain about that?
He did, but he was just starting his career back then, and it costs money to get legal representation and take these guys to court. So, yes, sir.
You sure you didn't get Rob Liefeld to draw that for him? There's something like Rob Liefeld.
It may be, yeah. If he had like a big chest that was out of proportion, I'd say yes. So, all right. So, this story so far is pretty shocking, isn't it? You know, all of the things that have been stolen. Well, we haven't gotten to the worst of it yet. All right. So, in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to try to share something with you that I discovered when I was researching this presentation. I thought I had this story of Batman's creation down pretty good, and then all of a sudden I discovered there was a Batman of 1932. So before I get to that, I want to point out that, first of all, Bob Kane does not deserve the benefit of the doubt. I want to list to you a couple of things that we've gone through so far just to summarize. He wasn't a good artist. He routinely swiped images from other artists without attributing credit. He stole that character, the Mask, from Dick Tracy. He stole several visual elements from the Black Bat. We won't have time to go into Robin, but Robin's costume was stolen from Dale Arden in Flash Gordon. Kane traced Todd McFarlane's drawing from 1987. He stole portions of Batman's origin story from the Bat. Well, there's like 20 other things. We won't go through them all. So the notion that Bob Kane may have stolen an idea from another creator, I think we have a pretty good foundation to make that case. All right. There's a magazine that I get called Alter Ego. It comes out about every 2 months. It's like a history of Golden Age comics. And right before this presentation went to press, I decided to go through every one that I had. I have like almost 200 issues to see if I may have missed something. And lo and behold, there's a character called Batman that first appeared in 1932, but no one knows about him. Frank Foster was the creator, and he came up with these images. And this was during the Depression. He and his wife had a family, and he wanted to try to get these things published, but it was more important for him to earn money so that his family could survive during the Depression, so he kind of put it to the side until 1937. He started going to different comic book publishers, including DC Comics. He left these drawings with DC Comics for a couple of weeks so that they could look at them and decide whether or not they wanted to publish them. Guess who worked for DC Comics at that time? Bob Kane. Now, we don't know if Bob Kane saw these. I think he did. But there's circumstantial evidence that he may have. This is a letter that Foster wrote to one of his friends where it says 1932 Village. That refers to Greenwich Village. That's where his friend was living. And there it says Batman. And can anybody make out what that says?
Nightwing.
Nightwing. Do you know what the significance of Nightwing is?
Later, Robin became Nightwing.
Yeah, which is interesting. Foster was considering naming Batman Nightwing, but he ended up going with Batman. And these drawings on the right are of another hero he created called the Raven. This is a letter that Foster's wife wrote summarizing her memory of when these images came out and what he did with them. It's interesting. This is a letter that Foster wrote to his friend Brian McDonald asking for his recollection. Do you remember us talking about these? And McDonald wrote a letter back and says, yes, I definitely remember those drawings, as we had lots of discussions concerning Batman. All right? One other piece of circumstantial evidence was, in order to make money to help feed his family, Foster was painting murals for the 1939 World's Fair. DC Comics had a booth at the 1939 World's Fair. Bob Kane was working at that booth. When Foster finished his murals, he was out of work, so he thought, I'm going to show these pictures again, see if anybody might be interested in publishing this. So he went to the DC booth. We don't know if Bob Kane was there when he showed him those drawings. It wouldn't be too hard to imagine that he was. So, at the very beginning of our presentation, I pointed out this image. With the magic of an iPhone, I was able to get this image of Foster's and then rotate it slightly. And then what did I do? I traced this image on top of it, and this is what I came up with. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if Bob Kane, this is Batman's very first appearance in that house ad, if he swiped this from this. Which again, to me, it's circumstantial evidence that Bob Kane was aware of the 1932 Batman. These are some similarities between them. His son says that the likelihood that this was a coincidence is 0, because no character had ever been named Batman before. We saw that pulp magazine from 1936 that had Batman, but the 1932 Batman was the first time that term Batman had ever been thought of. And then this shows like Foster's image that was superimposed by this, and then this is the Batman image that was from that movie that we saw at the very beginning. Here's his son holding the pictures, the original pictures. And we're almost time to adjourn. This is Bob. I want to read to you Bob Kane's tombstone. Okay, this is what was written. God bestowed a dream upon Bob Kane. Blessed with divine inspiration and a rich imagination, Bob created a legacy known as Batman. Introduced in May of 1939 in a May 1939 comic book, Batman grew from a tiny acorn into an American icon. a hand of God creation.
Good.
Batman and his world personify the eternal struggle of good versus evil, with God's laws prevailing in the end. Bob Kane, Bruce Wayne, Batman, they are one and the same. Bob infused his dual identity character with his own attributes: goodness, kindness, compassion, sensitivity, generosity, intelligence, integrity, courage, purity of spirit, and a love of all mankind. Batman is known as the Dark Knight, but through his deeds he walks in the light of a higher power, as did his creator, Bob Kane. This guy was so full of himself. Comic book historian after comic book historian who met him and interacted with him and had personal encounters with him, they all felt that he was full of himself. And this runs directly counter to the story that we just heard about how he allowed the co-creator, Bill Finger, to die in obscurity and in poverty. I had a section on Robin. I just wanted to point out real quick, this is Dale Arden's costume in Flash Gordon. Look how similar it is to Robin's. And in that Shadow magazine, the Partners Apparel, there was also a story in the back called The Grim Joker about a crime lord who was dressed as a Joker. And there was a silent movie in 1926 called The Man Who Laughs, who looks exactly like how they envisioned the Joker. That's from Coney Island. That may have influenced the look of the Joker as well. So we got 20 seconds left. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Yeah,
We
Jen.
can take more than 20 seconds for questions.
Okay, thank you.
I promise.
Woo! Jen?
Just for the consistency for my article, I know, even though Bob Kane might have taken this early 1930s design, Bill Finger, we still would say, is associated with all the right, how Batman looks and all the characters. I just don't want to contradict myself by saying that.
Yeah. There was a quote somewhere in my presentation, my notes, where everything good that we associate with Batman, you can think of Bill Finger. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
So I always like the villains of Batman. So how many of the original, I was surprised when I got into the history, how many of the villains are really from the Golden Age and those early Batman comics.
Yeah.
How many of the main rogues gallery were created by Bob Kane, Bill Finger?
Well, at the top of my head, I can think of the Riddler, the Penguin, Two-Face, Catwoman, who visually was based on one of Bob Kane's relatives. The Penguin was based on the Cool Cigarettes Penguin ad.
Yeah.
Two-Face was based on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I don't know who the Riddler was modeled after. Scarecrow was another original. Hugo Strange was one. I don't know off the top of my head other than that.
Were they out of it by the time Poison Ivy and Batgirl were in it?
Batgirl wasn't even thought of until 1965.
Yeah, that was for the show, right?
Yeah, for the show, that's
Yeah.
right. I happen to know that specifically because I have that comic book where she first appeared, and it's the most valuable comic book I have. By the way, if the very first appearance of Batman, anybody want to guess how much that goes for in a mint condition?
$700.
$700?
More
That's a
than
good
that.
guess. It's a little bit more than that.
$3 million.
Did I say 3 million?
$3 million.
Hey, or 3 million. How many? Yeah, it's 3 million. One just went Heritage Auctions for 3 million. And it's less than Superman because Superman was the first.
Yeah.
It broke the mold. Any other questions or comments I could try to answer for you? Yes, sir.
I like how the masked villain looks a lot like the Question.
The who?
The masked villain.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Question. It's a
Yeah.
lot like the Question.
Yeah. Yeah, the Question has a blank face, right? Yeah, thank you. Does he have his own book, or is he like in the Justice League, or?
He had his own book. Didn't wrote it for a very long time.
Okay.
It's created by Steve Ditko.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he was kind of an existential character. Yeah, that's right. Any other questions I could try to answer for you? Well, thanks you all for being here. Appreciate it. I'm going to put this on. Thank you. I'm going to put this on my YouTube channel if the video comes out well. So, Jen, I'll send you the link so you can
Thank
share
you.
it with your husband.
Yeah, he needs it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Where'd you get your shirt?
Oh, I can't remember now. Was it like FYE or Hot Topic or something like that?
I got mine.